Oh, hey, just reading the paper, keeping on top of how the Canucks are doing, see what they're saying here. Big part of sports, following sports, is looking at statistics. Now, pretty much any sport you follow, there's going to be some kind of statistics. My favorite sport, hockey, of course, they have goal leaders, assist leaders, point leaders, and all kinds of goalie statistics too. How they present them in the paper, though, is pretty... It's hard to see any patterns unless you look really closely at those numbers. Now, you could display data in a much more visual way with graphs, right? Graphs are visual representations of data. The word graph comes from the word graphic, which just means visual, right? Visual aspects of something. If you talk about a video game having good graphics, you're talking about it has really good visual aspects. So we're going to look right now at how you could take some of this data and sports stats and display it using a graph. Now when you're going to use a graph to display data, there's a lot of different types of graphs you can pick, and some types of graphs are better than others to display for whatever purpose you have. So we're going to look at goal leaders right now in the NHL and try and choose an appropriate type of graph to display and show how those goal leaders compare. We're going to do that right now.
All right, now, so we're going to look at presenting our data visually using graphs and looking at different graph choices. Now, I could just copy out the stats that I'm interested in out of the newspaper, but I think it's going to be quicker and easier to use the internet to find our goal leaders. So we're going to go to NHL.com here and see what we can see here. All right, and of course there are the Canucks on there clinching their division last night. But what I wanted to look at was stats about some of the league leaders. Now I'm going to choose goal leaders. Now we got Alex Ovechkin there with 30. Now this down here, this data, the next four are presented as a table, right? Organized lists here. Now, just for the sake of convenience here, I'm going to copy those ones because then I can paste it into a program I'm going to use to create some graphs, Microsoft Excel. Now, I'm missing Ovechkin off the top there, but really, you know what? It doesn't matter because I'm just trying to show you a graph anyway. So let's just go with these four guys, even though we don't have the leader there. If you're trying to create a graph within Excel, it's fairly easy because the program does all the work for you. Now let's make this a bit bigger first. Make that column bigger. There we go. Now we don't actually even need that column. So let's just go with those four. If we're going to create a graph within Excel, what you can do is you can highlight the numbers you're using. And again, I know I'm missing one there, but that's okay. And you can go to, depending on the version you're using, somewhere there's going to be an insert. They call it a chart here, not a graph. Now, there's a lot of different choices here and even more beyond that when you open up the actual window there. Let's say you decided you were going to create a circle graph for this because you're not sure, wow, there's so many different kinds. What am I going to create here? If I create a circle graph for this, I can just click on that and I get this circle graph that shows those four players, and they each have a region on the circle graph. Now, is this the right kind of graph for this data? When you create a circle graph, you were implying that these numbers here are out of some kind of a total. Now, does the total here mean anything? If I do equals sum of these four, just to see what that total is. Well, actually, coincidentally, the total is 100, which works well for my circle graph. Does this total of 100 mean anything here? Are each of these out of a certain total? Well, certainly not, right? There's certainly, obviously, we even forgot Ovechkin up here. He should be up there, which would make it 130. This 100 isn't the total number of goals that are divided up equally or divided up amongst those players. All right, so this is not going to be a good choice for this because it's not parts of a total or a whole. If this were, say, these four players going on an Easter egg hunt sometime and there was 100 eggs in total to find, And then this was the results afterwards, that Stamkos found 28 Easter eggs and Tavares found 26 and so on here. Then this would be an appropriate type of graph, because you'd be saying this is what fraction of the total of 100 eggs that they found. All right, but that's not the case with goals. So we don't want to use a circle graph here, so we're going to try something else. Let's go back to our window there. Now, if you are going to use a line graph, because that's another common kind of graph, let's see if that means anything. Is that the right kind of graph for this? Well, a line graph usually is used to represent progress over time. Now, this is not time here on the bottom axis. This is 4 different players. This is 4 different categories. All right. A line graph you don't use for different categories like that, because you're trying to imply progress over time here. And this is not over time. This is across 4 different players. If this were the same player and this were the goals they scored in each season, or the goals they scored in each month of a season, and this was, say, January, February, March, April, then a line graph would be appropriate, kind of because you're trying to show a downward trend over time. But if it's 4 different categories, line graph's not the right one. So we'll go back and look for another kind of graph here. Now, since really what we have is 4 categories and have 1 value for each of those categories, one of the best types of graph for that is a column graph or a bar graph. A lot of people call it a bar graph, but in Excel here they call a bar graph this where the bars are horizontal, and a column graph where the columns are vertical. So I'm going to do it this way because that's more the traditional way. And what you get is you get the 4 categories across the bottom axis, the horizontal axis, and then you get the values in each of those up the vertical axis. It's a nice visual way to show really how many they are and how they compare to each other, because you can kind of just compare the heights of the bars. Now, there are all kinds of options you can adjust to change the look, but overall, you have data that's in categories like this. Bar graph is a really good choice. Now, let's say we also had another set of values for these players. Let's say that we had assists as well. Now, to save some time here, I looked up their assists. So I'm going to label these columns here. Oops. Assists. And I found that Stamkos right now has 27 assists. Tavares has 19 assists. Jeff Carter has 7 assists. And Patrick Kane actually has far more assists than goals. He's got 32 right now. Now, we're going to make a slightly different kind of bar graph here because we have 2 sets of values for each category. We're going to create a double bar graph. Double bar graph, obviously, because there's 2 different bars for each of the players, each of the categories. All right, and it's just a good visual way to show both those things. You can see whether a player has more or less goals, whether how much the difference is, right? Obviously for Kane here, it's quite a big difference. He's got way more assists than goals, and obviously for Carter, it's the opposite, right? Far more goals than assists. So double bar graph, good for when you're representing 2 different values for each. Now, before we finish talking about bar graphs, here we're going to make one more type of bar graph. We're going to get rid of this, and we'll go back there. We're actually going to make what's called a stacked bar graph. A stacked bar graph is good if you have 2 different values for each category, each player, and if it makes sense to add those 2 things together. If adding those 2 values together has meaning, then a stacked bar graph makes sense, because you have the blue represents goals, the red represents assists, but the height of the bar altogether, you can compare total points, right? Because goals and assists together are total points. So it'll actually sort of allows you to compare 3 things, because you can look at the heights of the blue bars. You can more or less compare how big the red areas are, and you can look at the heights of the thing altogether. So that's a stacked bar graph. All right, so several different kinds of bar graphs that are good when you have data in categories like this, players, as well as we looked at circle graphs and line graphs. All right, so lots of different options for displaying data. Certainly if you're working with a program like Excel, there's all kinds of different other funky graphs as well that you could explore, but those are sort of the basic ones that are used.